beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts.
Greetings and welcome back. The Washington Post reports today, European allies pile pressure on Israel to increase aid to Gaza. The Netherlands is leading a push for the EU to review its trade ties with Israel. Meanwhile, the UN said it had been given permission to send about 100 trucks into Gaza. What is there to review? And from the perspective of realpolitik, as the world watches genocide in historic Palestine, why aren't more countries doing more? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is, as the Washington Post reports, a growing chorus of European countries are pushing for the European Union to review the bloc's trade ties with Israel and pressuring the country to lift its blockade on Gaza, a day after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said a minimal amount of aid would be allowed as Israel expands its military operations with the aim of taking control of the entire Gaza Strip. My guest is a former UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order from 2012 to 2018, senior lawyer with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, secretary of the UN Human Rights Committee, and chief of the Petitions Department. He's the author of 9 books and more than 200 scholarly articles, many of which are available on Counterpunch. He has written a human rights trilogy, including The Human Rights Industry, Countering Mainstream Narratives, Fake News, Fake Law, Fake Freedom, and Building a Just World Order. Professor Alfred Maurice de Zayas. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you so much, Wilmer, for inviting me. I am happy to be here, very unhappy with the world situation. But that's what we're going to be talking about. And before we continue, want to remind readers, or rather listeners, that they can become active and engage with the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Last year, 22nd of May, 2024, I submitted a 29-page legal brief on the issue of complicity in genocide. And I specifically pointed fingers at Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. And on the 15th of May, 2025, that is last week, I submitted a follow-up on that communication, and I expanded it to include Kaja Kallas, the foreign minister of the European Union, and other functionaries of the European Commission. Now, the European leaders, they may have a rhetoric of human rights and humanitarian law. Essentially, they're a bunch of hypocrites. I would call it Himalayan hypocrisy on the part of Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, and of course his predecessor, Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock. It is a scandal. I mean, European values do not exist. The values of the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms have been blatantly abandoned and betrayed by the leaders of the European Union. And especially when you have genocide going on, look at the Convention of 1948. It says the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So the emphasis is on preventing the genocide. Now, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians began already in 1947-48. That's when you have 750,000 of them expelled from their homes, when you have a huge artificial refugee situation, notwithstanding any number of resolutions of the General Assembly, which of course were not implemented. Now, you have Israel, a country that owes its existence to the United Nations, to the work of the United Nations in nation building, which of also, unfortunately, only 50%. Two states were supposed to emerge, a state of Palestine and a state of Israel, whereas only one state emerged, received trillions of dollars from the United States and from Europe, and the Palestinians were left to fester in their refugee camps. Now, on top of it, we have to deal with the issue of hate speech against the Palestinians. It's quite clear that here the victims are the Palestinians. The perpetrators are the Israelis. But that is not what you hear in the mainstream media. The narrative is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that it is a model for the rest of the Middle East. And the fact that Israel was born in terrorism. Don't forget the King David Hotel blown up by Zionist terrorists in 1946. All the terrorist acts against the Palestinians to force them out of their homes, to terrorize them so that in order to save their skin, they had to leave their olive groves, etc. 1948, Fokke Bernadotte, the representative of the Secretary General, who goes in good faith to Palestine to try to make peace, to try to arrange for the Palestinians also to have a voice, he gets assassinated by a Zionist terrorist group. That gets elevated to the International Court of Justice. There's a case condemning Israel for its responsibility in the assassination of the UN representative. Do you read that in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, etc.? No.
No.
I mean, it has been erased. That part of the history has been erased. And without a doubt, historically, you can read it.
Mm-hmm.
If Ilan Pappes, The Ethnic Cleansing of the Palestinians. You can read it in countless books of Norman Finkelstein. You can read it in articles by Professor Jeffrey Sachs and many others who tell you this is not just self-defense on the part of the Israelis who were attacked by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. This did not begin in 2023. This began in 1947, and it's been non-stop aggression of the state of Israel against all of its neighbors, against Lebanon and Jordan and Syria. And again, we can't go on to I've written about the SS Liberty, the U.S. ship that was attacked by Israel. Imagine that, they're supposed to be our allies. They're supposed to be our friends. And in order, that was a false flag action in 1967 to try to force the United States into the war on the side of Israel and bombard Cairo, bombard the Egyptians, because the attempt was to make the Egyptians responsible for an attack that killed, I don't know how many, something like 40 American sailors, et cetera, and it was carried out. There's no question about the facts. It was carried out by Israel under orders of the Israeli government. So the Israeli government is a terrorist government. It is a criminal government from day one. However, you have a mainstream media that engages in apology of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. As I said, many authors have dealt with the issues. Here is Norman Finkelstein. You also have an entire book on Gaza. You have our president, Jimmy Carter, who wrote Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. You have Jimmy Carter, who also wrote another book on Palestine, We Can Have Peace in the Holy Land. You have Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian, and he is at the University of Exeter in England. So here you have Gaza in crisis, and Pappé has written several other books on the issue. Now, what's happening? You have here major historians, major professors of international law who are writing, this is genocide and we must stop it. Now, unfortunately, it's not being stopped. The Europeans are just using rhetoric. The Europeans have come with too little, too late to help the Palestinians. If the Europeans had any credibility, if the United States had any credibility, they would have ensured that a state of Palestine would have emerged in the 1950s, and that country would have been made, shall we say, an economically viable and happy country if the United States and Europe had wanted that. But from day one, we have been complicit in the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians with the help of the mainstream media. So you really have to change the narrative, but people have been so thoroughly indoctrinated, so thoroughly brainwashed, that it is difficult. I mean, I would not dare to speak as I'm speaking to you now in Germany, for instance. Germany has very tough legislation on anti-Semitism, what they call anti-Semitism. So if you criticize, as I do, the government of Israel and the policies of the government of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. I mean, if I go to Germany, I'll be arrested. I mean, I know that. So, notwithstanding the fact that I have many invitations by many universities, I always say thank you, but no thank you. I mean, you've allowed your country to become a totalitarian government. You have practices reminiscent of the practices of the 1930s. And if you want to hear my point of view, I will speak. But I need an absolute immunity, absolute guarantee that I will not be subject to a frivolous and vexatious judicial proceeding against me, which of course would cost me 30,000 euros, would cost me half a year or a year of my life defending myself against ridiculous accusations. That being the case, Germany, big cross on it. And Friedrich Merz, the current chancellor, is even worse than his predecessor Olaf Scholz or Angela Merkel. I mean, I don't see any morality in the current German administration. And I would hope that at some point the Germans will change their government and will demand accountability from their leaders, because their leaders, by sending military and economic aid to the state of Israel, have become complicit in the genocide. This is clear, Article 3, paragraph little e of the Genocide Convention. Beyond that, let me speak about some other issues. The issue of mass population transfers. I wrote my very first article, my first scholarly article, exactly 50 years ago, 50.
Wow.
Here it is. In the Harvard International Law Journal, a 52-page analysis under the title International Law and Mass Population Transfers. So here is the beginning of the article, International Law and Mass Population Transfers. And the article was translated the same year into German and into Spanish. It was quoted extensively. And I was indicating, look, there is a right to the homeland. You have a right to live where you were born, where your ancestors lived, where your ancestors are buried, where your church is, etc., etc. You cannot just simply be kicked out of your home. That is a very fundamental right. You know, the right of self-determination. Well, you can only exercise the right of self-determination if you have not been kicked out. I mean, you can only vote if you have not been prevented from voting by being expelled from your home. Now, my first book in 1977 is called Nemesis at Potsdam. By the way, I got the title from none other than George F. Kennan, whom I visited several times at Princeton. And Nemesis at Potsdam deals with the expulsion of 15 million ethnic Germans from East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, East Brandenburg, Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, where their ancestors had been for some 700 years, much longer than Americans had been in the United States and Canada. As the case may be, 15 million expellees, 2 million dead, and the 2 million figure is actually conservative. I mean, there are estimates that it's 3 or 4 million who perished in the course of the expulsion. As the case may be, a topic that was completely taboo. My book was the first one to come out in the English language. And this is Routledge Revivals. It came out with Routledge, and amusingly enough, just surfing the internet, I find that book being offered. And I said, well, curious. We did sell very well.
Mm-hmm.
And but then the book sold out and they didn't bring out a new edition. And now I see Routledge Revivals, Nemesis at Potsdam. Well, they put it out, although the copyright is with me. And when I saw it that it was being sold, I said, well, guys, how about my royalties? And, I called them on the phone. And whoever it was I spoke with said, oh, we thought you were dead. And, well, I'm not. So
Newsflash.
You send me a contract, I sign it, and you pay my royalties. But what is important is that the world learned nothing of this experience.
Mm-hmm.
What did the world do with the fact that 15 million people were expelled from their homes, beaten to death, raped? I mean, it was really savage. And by the way, it's not. I mean, Routledge is a very respectable publisher.
Mm-hmm.
It's a serious publisher. And I got for the preface none other than Ambassador and Undersecretary of State Robert Murphy. Robert Murphy, you see here the preface.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Murphy was the political advisor of General Eisenhower and a participant in the conferences of Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. And he himself was horrified at what was happening because he was a good Catholic like me.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I'm very happy with Pope
with the new Pope
Francis and with the new Pope. I expect that the new Pope will do very good things, and he seems to have his heart in the right place, and he wants to have a church of the poor, as indeed was the thought of Pope Francis, whom I very, very much liked. And by the way, I ended my book, Building a Just World Order, with a quote from his encyclical Laudato Si. So Laudato Si means be praised, meaning God be praised. But in this case, he is focusing on our responsibility, intergenerational responsibility for future generations, and what I mean we really have to do to fix the mess that we have done in the world. And if you allow me to quote very quickly from Laudato Si, I think it is befitting to end this book with reflections by Pope Francis. Quote, once we start to think about the kind of world we are leaving to future generations, we look at things differently. We realize that the world is a gift which we have freely received and must share with others. Since the world has been given to us, we can no longer view reality in a purely utilitarian way in which efficiency and productivity are entirely geared to our individual benefit. Intergenerational solidarity is not optional, but rather a basic question of justice, since the world we have received also belongs to those who will follow us. End of quote. Mm-hmm. So here you see that Pope Francis and Pope Leon XIV are both focusing on saving civilization, in saving the world in peace. It was very important that Pope Leo's first statement focused on peace, and his first homily also focused on peace. So peace not only in Gaza, we want peace in Ukraine, We want peace in Sudan. We want peace in all countries where there is armed conflict. But in order to have peace, as President Donald Trump has said, you have to address the root causes of the conflict. Peace is not just putting a little Band-Aid here and then a Band-Aid there.
Mm-hmm.
You have to address the problems. And the problem in the Ukraine is quite clear. We wanted, the reports of the Rand Corporation and other think tanks. I mean, our goal was to dismember Russia and to have our transnational corporations make trillions of dollars out of the natural resources of Russia. So we wanted to use Ukraine as our proxy to weaken Russia in the hope or in the gamble that Russia was going to collapse, that the people were going to rise up against Putin, throw him out, and then we put some puppet in there too, and then the puppet is going to work for us. I mean, just pure imperialism.
Right.
Our 21st century neocolonialism. And so Trump says you have to address the root causes. So if you provoke, which, by the way, as a Catholic, for me, provocation is sin. And my dad always said, when my brother and I got into a fight, my father said, who provoked this? Because he thought that whoever provoked it bears greater responsibility than he who responded to the provocation. And if NATO expansion, and this is what the Ukraine war is all about, should not be called the Ukraine war. It should be called the war of NATO expansion. That's the way I would write it in a book. If I was writing a history book on it, that would be the title of the chapter. So it was provoked, how? Not only by the expansion, but by arming Ukraine to the teeth. It was provoked by our complicity in the overthrow of the legitimate, democratically elected president of Ukraine.
Wait a minute. It needs to be mentioned that the arming of Ukraine came in the first Trump administration.
Yes.
It was Donald Trump
who
armed Ukraine. And then it was the Biden administration that fomented the Maidan coup in 2014 and overthrew the democratically elected government that we now claim we have to go into Ukraine and defend democracy.
Right. No, the narrative is so absurd. What you read in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, I feel like saying, come on, just give me a break. Just give me a break. Just cut the crap. Admit our guilt, admit that we gambled, and that we lost.
And we lost big.
There's a thing you would expect that we Americans, who have such a long attachment to competitive sports, who have such attachment to rough football, rugby, to rough basketball. If anything, sport should teach you how to lose. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. If you lost, then you try to find out why you lost and try to do better the next time in the next game. But of course, people don't die in a football game or in a basketball game. People do die in the meat grinder in Ukraine. And of course, people do die in the targeted genocide going on against the Palestinians. But there again, the information war is central to maintaining this unjust world order that we see. Yeah.
So let me ask you this in terms of the narrative and what you're just talking about, because just in today's Washington Post, European foreign ministers in Brussels are considering a proposal, and potentially suspend EU trade cooperation with Israel, as though they're just now finding this out. A push being led by the Netherlands, seen as one of Israel's close allies in the bloc, and with support from countries including France.
They could have done it 50 years ago.
So what is there to review? And from the perspective of realpolitik, as the world watches, why aren't more countries doing more?
My feeling is it's a question of coordination. And my hope actually is.
What do you mean by that? A question of coordination. What do you mean by that?
You need a country like South Africa that took Israel on. A country that had the guts to bring the genocide to the International Court of Justice. 13 other countries joined up and have made presentations to the International Court of Justice, but the ICJ is dragging its feet. We're not talking about a little dispute about where you draw the demarcation line between two countries. You're talking about people being killed as we're speaking.
So
people are being murdered as we're speaking.
Why is the ICJ, who's behind the decisions to not take action?
My feeling is, because I know several.
That's why I'm asking you.
I mean, I've known judges of the International Court of Justice for the last 50 years. Matter of fact, I was a candidate for a very senior post in the Secretariat, not as a judge, in the Secretariat. And it was quite embarrassing because I had 14 judges in favor of my candidacy and one judge who blocked it. And blocked it, you know why? Because of this book.
Okay.
He blocked it because he said that Nemesis at Potsdam was a fascist book, and he didn't want to have a fascist in the Secretariat. And so if you're willing to break a taboo, if you're a whistleblower, if you're willing to fight for justice, not for politics, not for politically correct narratives, but you just see that there's a major injustice and you want to write about it, well, there's a price to pay.
Oh, no
and
question.
I had to pay it many times.
No question.
In the United Nations, I'm convinced that if I had written not a single book and not a single article, that I would have climbed in the system much higher. I mean, I know in specific cases that my book publications actually were crucial in denying me promotions in the UN system. That's how come I decided to take early retirement and then go back to academia, go back to teaching, because teaching is my first passion, my first vocation. And I never intended when I went to the United Nations to stay there for so many years, for so many decades. I intended just to do very interesting job. I mean, I was the chief drafter for the Human Rights Committee, and most of the early decisions of the Human Rights Committee were written by me. And actually, those who know drafting and recognize style will say, oh, yeah, that's definitely Zayas who wrote that, because that's his style. And of course, you would draft it, it will go into the working group. The working group would find it fine, and then it would be adopted by the chamber, by the majority, and then it goes from my hands to the committee into international law. It becomes direct jurisprudence. So it was a challenging job, and I had a great boss. So those who think that I am too critical of the United Nations system, and those who think that I am that I want to tear it all down. No, I don't want to tear it down. I want to fix it.
You want it to operate and actually achieve the or make accomplishments based upon its mission. Let me ask this, because you mentioned the Nobel Prize earlier in the conversation, and there are those who posit that Donald Trump is just I was trying to be more artful in my language, that he is craving that's the word I'm looking for.
Oh, I know
he's craving a Nobel Prize,
and he will not get it.
Okay.
I mean, it's so scandalous. The man is a megalomaniac. We know that. And he's an opportunist. We know that. But even though the Nobel Peace Prize Committee is very politicized and is hardly professional, Donald Trump has no chance at all. Whom I would have liked to have seen awarded the Nobel Peace Prize are people like Julian Assange, people who have actually suffered a lot for their convictions and for their contribution to our knowledge of war and peace. We have to know what crimes are being committed in our name. We have to know if the United States and NATO countries are committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere in the world. We must know that. That's why a whistleblower like Julian Assange is so important. And of course, he had no chance of getting it because the same problem as you already broached. Who are the members? It's like, who are the justices of the International Court of Justice? You only get nominated if you're going to toe the line. I mean, do you think that someone like Professor Richard Falk would ever be nominated to the International Court of Justice? Of course not, because Richard Falk is a professional international lawyer who has been defending the international order and defending the United Nations Charter as akin to a world constitution. So you don't want that. You want someone who's going to take orders from Washington. Same thing goes.
So is that why Barack Obama was awarded the Nobel Prize based upon a speech he gave in Germany?
No, it's a disgrace.
But is that why he was awarded the prize and hadn't done anything other than given a speech?
No, the man, shall we say, the king of the drones. No one had killed as many civilians with drones as Obama had. But Obama, to this day, has an incredibly positive press. The media loves him. I mean, if I compare Obama to George W. Bush, I think I prefer Obama.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that I consider him meritorious to be the laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize. Who deserved the Nobel Peace Prize? Martin Luther King Jr.
Sure.
Who deserved it? Nelson Mandela.
In fact, people need to read Obama's Nobel acceptance speech, where he says, and I'll paraphrase, but I'm fairly close to the quote. He says, "I stand here on the shoulders of Dr. King and Nelson Mandela, but," and as soon as he says "but," you know you have a problem in the next sentence. He says, "I am the leader," I think he says something along the lines of, "I am the leader of a nation, therefore my responsibilities are different."
Well, his responsibility for the American people was to keep us out of harm's way. to keep us out of wars and not to get us involved in the putsch in Maidan, to get us involved in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. I mean,
the murder of
the responsibility of Barack Obama and of Hillary Clinton,
of course,
and of Victoria Nuland for all of these atrocities.
And wasn't Samantha Power involved in that too? Wasn't she? Wasn't Samantha Power involved in the Libyan issue?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think at that time she was professor at the Kennedy School.
Okay. Okay.
Samantha Power and I both shared an award. That was back in 2003. Samantha Power had just published a book called A Problem from Hell. And she was talking about genocide. And I had just published a book on the genocide against the Armenians. So there's an award that the Armenians give, the scholarship excellence award, etc., which that year we both got. And Samantha Power spoke very well at the United Nations when she was the ambassador for Obama. And I must say her speech in November 2016, when the resolution of the General Assembly concerning the lifting of the embargo against Cuba was adopted by 191 votes in favor and 2 abstentions. The United States had always voted against. This is the first time in history that the United States does not vote against the resolution, but only abstains. The United States and Israel.
Of course.
And in that context, she gave an explanation of both. And it was really a brilliant speech. I loved it. I wish that she had meant it. Because after that, of course, she became, as you know, the head of U.S. aid. And U.S. aid has a very mixed record. U.S. aid has done some good things, and U.S. aid has done very bad things, like the National Endowment for Democracy, which essentially is there to overthrow governments, is there to subvert governments, is there to finance so-called NGOs that are really not NGOs. They are there to destabilize governments, and that is why more and more countries have adopted legislation requiring NGOs that are financed from abroad to disclose their financiers. And that, of course, many human rights, quote, activists, unquote, have condemned. And I say not at all. I think this legislation, the so-called foreign agent legislation, is there to defend democracy, to defend the right, say, of Hungarians to elect the government that they want to elect and not to be subjected to fake news and fake history and fake law propagated by American or European financed NGOs. So there's nothing special about such legislation, because the first such legislation was 1938, I think, the American legislation, the Foreign Agents Act. Any foreign NGO that established itself in the United States had to disclose where it got its money from. You don't want to have an NGO in the United States propagating Nazi propaganda, for instance. paid, by the Nazi government or anything of that nature.
Mhm.
So this kind of transparency is necessary. But when it is done by Georgia, or it is done by Hungary, or it's done by Slovakia, oh, horrible, horrible. This is a restriction of human rights of the people of Georgia or of Slovakia or what have you. I mean, this hypocrisy, I've lived it. That's why I wrote my book, The Human Rights Industry, because whereas when I joined, imagine, I joined the UN back in 1980. That's when I was hired. And it was an entirely different office. I was hired by the great Professor Theo van Boven from the Netherlands, who interviewed me personally. I explain all of that in this book in any event. And there, at that time, there was a level of professionalism. There was a level of commitment to human rights, not commitment to a country or commitment to an ideology. The only ideology we had was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's what we wanted to promote. And we did successfully. Unfortunately, gradually, especially in the 1990s, and then accelerated in the early 2000s, the House got more and more politicized. So that, unfortunately, when you look up to the United Nations, I think that the United Nations is going to solve your problems. I say, think again. If you think that the rapporteurs are going to do something for you, think again. Maybe 70% of the rapporteurs are not independent and are not doing what they're supposed to do, whereas a mere 20 or 30% are genuine. I must say, and it's getting worse in the selection process. I do not think that today, if I were to postulate for any vacancy as an independent expert, I don't think I would be selected. I think I would be exited rather early in the competition, because they know what I do. They know that I do not take instructions from anybody, and that I do my own analysis, and I say as it is. And they don't want that. They don't want someone who calls a spade a spade. They want someone who is really political and diplomatic and knows that there are certain red lines, that there are certain countries that you're not supposed to criticize. And if you do, there'll be a price to pay. So as I said, my chances in the UN system today are like zero. That's why, again, I do what I can.
Right.
That reminds me again of Noam Chomsky. When I visited Noam, I'd met him when I was a student at Harvard, and he was at MIT. And when I gave a lecture at Harvard back in 2013, I hopped on a cab and went to see him. Because I said, Noam, how can you stand it? I mean, for the last 55, 60 years, you've been writing the best analysis of world problems and giving concrete, pragmatic, implementable solutions. And the world is getting worse and worse. And, Noam looks at me and says, Zayas, we do what we can and what we must. The fact that what we must, we have to do certain things because that is the ethical thing to do. And no matter what the punishment is, no matter what price you have to pay, you must do it. And if enough people did it, and if enough people were, shall we say, adventurous enough to go against the mainstream, then the mainstream would not be able to get away with what it does.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's why I say, and I can give you later, I will send it to you by email, how to submit cases to the International Criminal Court. Not that the International Criminal Court is going to do much. Don't expect that.
Mm-hmm.
But if there is a flood of cases against Israel because of the genocide,
Mm-hmm.
and people ask not only for an arrest warrant against Gallant and against Netanyahu, but against also the president, Yitzhak Herzog
Mm-hmm.
of Israel, and all of the senior military of the Israeli Defense Forces. If they are subject to investigation and indictment, that might make an impact. But as you said, the Europeans are coming too late.
Mm-hmm.
And they are saying things that they should have said 50 years ago, 60 years ago. They are complicit since the beginning in this misery that the Palestinians are enduring.
You talk about hypocrisy. And let me, there's this pressure now for the Zionist government to allow the aid in to occupied Palestine. And there's an article today, Smotrich says allowing minimal aid into Gaza will ensure Israel can destroy the strip. Mm-hmm. The finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said yesterday that allowing minimal aid will ensure that Israel has continued support from its friends to continue with its goal of destroying the Palestinian territory. Can you provide any clarity to what I perceive to be utter hypocrisy and insanity?
Well, as I have written in numerous articles, and one that hopefully comes out tomorrow in Counterpunch, is not so much conscious hypocrisy. You see, if you yourself are indoctrinated, and Israelis are very indoctrinated,
right?
If you are
I get you
subjectively convinced,
right,
that you are right,
mm-hmm.
and that everybody else is wrong. If you have been taught to think that God himself
mm-hmm.
gave you this land, and this land is yours.
Mm-hmm.
Let me stop this because it's annoying. I'm just stopping it. I see it's. Yeah.
That
was a phone call from Germany. Usually I take the phone out.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Sorry about that. I should have taken the phone out.
No, it's fine. But I understand. I want to reiterate this so that in case some folks have missed it, you're saying because Smotrich has been indoctrinated into believing that right is wrong,
yeah,
that it's not hypocrisy for him to speak wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Continue.
Okay. So no, of course it's wrong, but the fact is, I can give you some concrete examples.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed back in 1972, 73, 74, 75 in Germany the 6 still living adjutanten of Hitler. I interviewed his pilot, his chauffeur, his valet. I interviewed his secretaries. I interviewed no less than 20 generals and admirals and very, very senior people in the government.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that one of them had a sense of remorse or a sense of guilt? No, they saw themselves as defending Germany,
mm-hmm.
and as doing what was necessary to revise the unjust Treaty of Versailles. So everyone finds an excuse for himself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I was just following orders.
yeah,
I was just following orders.
Those are for the lower ones.
Right.
I telling the person who was calling me that I'm on a Zoom call, not to call again. Yeah. The fact is that you can believe your own propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And I am convinced that Joe Biden always saw himself as the good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And that George W. Bush always saw himself as the good guy. They do not accept that they can be wrong. And that's one of the failures of education in most countries. I would think that if you have good education, you should be taught to develop a, how should I put it? You should develop the faculty of self-criticism. You should be able to ask the question, am I living according to my own principles? Are my premises correct? But instead of that, we double down.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we realize that we made an Olympic miscalculation in Ukraine, but we're doubling down. Not Trump. Trump is the one, he has different priorities. I mean, he wants to focus on China, so he doesn't want to be bothered with the Ukraine, which was Biden's war, so he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. That I can understand, but the Europeans who follow the lead of Joe Biden, well, the Brits are outdoing themselves in nonsense. The Brits, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, they want to have a European criminal tribunal to try Russian war crimes. Well, are they aware that the Russians, not only since 2022, since 2014, the Russians have an office that has been collecting systematically instances of violations of the laws of war, war crimes, crimes against humanity committed against civilians by Ukrainian forces, particularly in the years 2014 to 2022, when some 14,000 Russian civilians in Lugansk and in Donetsk and in the Donbass were killed by Ukrainian forces. Now, they have documented cases of torture of civilians, rape, of cases of extrajudicial execution of individuals, journalists, and soldiers, prisoners of war. So there's a huge documentation of war crimes committed by Ukrainians and by the mercenaries, by Brits, French, German mercenaries in this war. So it's not just a one-way street. And my proposal, when I issued on 2 occasions Blueprint for Peace in Ukraine, I wrote, look, there's no sense having an international war crimes tribunal. It only keeps the hatreds alive. What you have to do instead of that is investigate the crimes. I'm not in favor of impunity, far from it, but the investigations are already an obligation provided for in Geneva Convention number 3 and in Geneva Convention number 4, in particular, Geneva Convention number 4, Articles 146, 47, 48, so that each country has to make sure that its army is not an army of criminals. They have to keep discipline in their own armies, and they have to try them. And unfortunately, rarely do Ukrainians try Ukrainians or Russians try Russians. The same as during the Vietnam War.
Sure.
I mean, the only case you remember is that of Rusty Calley, who was the main, shall we say,
the My Lai massacre?
Actor in the massacre of My Lai. By the way, it pays to reread Seymour Hersh's book, My Lai 4.
Mm-hmm.
That's a book that came out in 1970. I remember reading it when I was still at Harvard Law School. And it moved me very much because of the same phenomenon I told you about. Rusty Calley saw himself as the good guy, saw himself as doing his duty. He couldn't understand what was happening to him in this trial because he thought he was doing the right thing when he massacred these 300 to 500 Vietnamese. I mean, I would have wanted to see Maxwell Taylor tried. I wanted to see the senior officers, the generals tried, the politicians who lied to the American people, as we know from the Pentagon Papers. Those are the people who should be brought to justice, and not this little lieutenant. And in any event, this, had it not been for the scandal produced by Seymour Hersh at the time, probably there would not have been any trials.
Let me ask you this: we're almost out of time, and what if you can spare one more question?
Sure.
And that is, there's an interesting article in Sputnik entitled "From Hawkish to Panicky: How Western Media Reacts to Putin-Trump Call."
Yes.
And it's a collection of headlines from the Financial Times, from the BBC, and other papers. The call represented, quote, "a major victory for the Russian leader," end quote. "The U.S. is done putting pressure on Russia." This is from the Financial Times. "As Donald Trump made no promise of future U.S. sanctions." The way that this is framed.
Exactly. But I hate to tell you, it's the same thing in the BBC.
Right. They quote the BBC.
I mean, I am shocked how the Neue Zürcher Zeitung here in Switzerland, how the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, how Le Monde reports on this Putin Donald Trump telephone. Not only this one, also the prior one.
Right. Well, here's my question. Here's my question. They frame Putin not going to Turkey as though it was some major insult, when in fact, if I understand the way that went down, it was Zelensky that said, "I'll see you in Turkey," and Putin said, "I'm not coming. You're crazy." So if you just a minute or so on how this is being framed, and what is your analysis of reality?
Well, I rejected all of that narrative after I read the headline. It's so rigged. It is so loaded. When you read these interpretations of the New York Times and the BBC and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, they clearly want to maintain the myth that NATO is totally innocent, that NATO has nothing to do with this war, that we did not provoke it, and that it was only Putin who wants to reestablish the Soviet empire. I mean, this narrative has been invented in the West, and the fact that it gets repeated ad nauseum does not make it true. But it is reflected in every single article. I see the Putin Donald Trump telephone call as a very positive sign. I mean, Putin has made his position clear since 2014. There's
Correct.
nothing new. He is saying exactly the same concerns at Minsk and at the Normandy format and at the OSCE and in the two treaties that Lavrov put on the table in December 2021. I mean, the position is very simple. 2 points. No more threatening from NATO. Stop provoking. And threatening, by the way, is contrary to Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. It's already a crime if you are threatening another country.
And wait a minute, it also violates your father's premise of do not provoke the fight.
Yes. And then the second point that Putin from the very beginning had, respect the right of Russians to be Russian, to speak Russian, to maintain their culture, their traditions, etc. The Minsk agreements would have kept the territorial integrity of the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that was demanded was they should have a level of autonomy that guarantees them the right to use Russian and to administer their affairs within Ukraine. Putin was not asking for more.
Mm-hmm.
Also, in the treaties put on the table, draft treaties, because they were never accepted,
right,
by Lavrov, territorial integrity of Ukraine guaranteed. And but no, our intention was just slap him in the face, just throw down the gauntlet, and this time Putin picked up the gauntlet. I wish he hadn't, but he did. Mm-hmm. And now we're in a situation in which we miscalculated, that we gambled with the lives of 1 million Ukrainians. And of course, they bled to death. We provided them with weapons, and the Germans want to continue providing them with weapons. It is insane. I mean, accept 2 conditions for peace. No more NATO expansion and guaranteed self-determination for the people of the Donbass. Given that, you will have peace tomorrow.
And James Baker promised no NATO expansion to Gorbachev in 1990. So that's not a new idea. In fact, it's an idea that the United States put on the table and then has since violated.
No, well, and it not only has violated, I mean, systematically undermined. I mean, and it's and when I see a professor saying, "No, we never gave assurances," sorry, when you have heads of state or when you have secretaries of state meeting, there's always people taking minutes. The minutes are proof that these things were said and agreed upon, and that they were crucial.
Isn't there I think it's an international criminal court case from 1932 or 1933, it's Greenland v. Norway maybe, that says statements made by representatives of other countries are considered to be valid.
Yes, that is customary international law. Okay. You are absolutely right.
Okay.
So that you don't have to write it in stone. You don't have to make it part of the treaty. If the other party relies on it,
detrimental reliance.
You are bound by the agreement. It's just that the United States was so powerful that say we're gonna push it down their throats. They can do nothing about it. And of course, we miscalculated because they have done something about it.
Professor Alfred de Zayas, thank you so much for your time. That analysis was, as your analysis always is, spot on. Greatly appreciate it. Go ahead and return your call to Germany and tell them I said hello.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilmer Leon. I look forward to seeing you again, maybe personally someday when I go visit my brother and sister in the States.
Yeah. Or when I come to Switzerland.
Very well.
Good. Okay. Deal. Thank you. All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. A couple of things. That man is something special. A couple of things. We taped this early, so because he's in Switzerland and there's a 6-hour time difference, and we didn't want him up at 11 o'clock at night. But from what I was able to discern with the help of my wonderful producer before we started this discussion today, we have 2 new members, Eric, Unity, and Cherie. Thank you so much. And if there are those that have joined or become members during the interview, you will truly receive your acknowledgement tomorrow. There's one thing I want to read. Professor de Zayas wanted to get to this point, and he didn't. So I'm going to get to the point now. He wrote a piece in Counterpunch in February of this year, February 13th. It's called Genocide Files, From Pequots to Palestinians, From Manifest Destiny to Gaza Riviera. And he quotes a 1964 book by Dr. King called Why We Can't Wait. And Dr. King, in Why We Can't Wait, he addresses the horrendous crimes of slavery and the indignities suffered by African Americans. And he also talks about what was called the class of civilizations in the 16th and 19th centuries. But Dr. King writes this, quote, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation that tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated the tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it." Dr. King wrote that in 1964. And I believe if you change the original American to the Palestinian, and if you change America to the Zionist government of Israel, if this were a mathematical equation, when you did the addition, you'd wind up with the same answer. Professor Alfred Maurice de Zayas, thank you, sir, for joining me today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Brother John Jeter is going to join us. Please follow, review, subscribe, share the show. Follow us on social media. All the links you'll find are below in the show description. Remember, folks, that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. John Jeter will join us. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.